She never meant to call him, the man who shattered her heart and vanished 3 years ago. But one tiny cry over the phone changes everything. He hears it, and his world stops. Her secret, her son, is his. Now, a dangerous past, a mafia empire, and a lifetime of regret collide. Will he save the child, or lose everything forever? Welcome back to Heart-Woven Tales. I'm your storyteller, Selena. I hope you're doing well today. I'd love to know, where are you listening to me from? Make sure you stay with me till the very end because this story will take you on a ride full of love, suspense, and unforgettable moments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a tale. Now, let's dive in. Jenni pressed her back against the faded kitchen counter, holding Max close as his tiny body trembled with another wave of discomfort. Her eyes burned with sleeplessness, the kind that carved deep shadows beneath her lashes and made her heart feel heavier than her own body. She'd been trying for hours to reach the doctor, pacing across the narrow apartment with desperation eating at her every step. Max's soft whimpers broke through the silence like needles, piercing the fragile calm she was struggling to hold on to. She wiped her sweaty palm on her jeans and inhaled sharply, praying the number she was searching for would finally appear through her blurred vision. Her fingers shook as she scrolled through the contact list, names rising and falling on the screen like ghosts from a life she barely recognized anymore. She squinted, scrolling too fast, looking for the pediatrician's number she needed more than anything. Her heartbeat thudded painfully in her ears, drowning out the distant city noise that filtered through her window. When she finally found a number she thought belonged to the doctor, she pressed it without hesitation, too drained to double-check. Max whimpered again, and her heart squeezed painfully. "Shh, baby. Mommy's here," she whispered, kissing his forehead as she held the phone to her ear. A deep, familiar voice answered on the third ring, smooth, cold, commanding, and sharp enough to slash open wounds she had spent years trying to heal. "Who is this?" The voice vibrated through her, freezing her from the inside out. Her breath hitched, the sound dying in her throat as recognition struck like lightning. Alex Stuart, the man who once held her heart like it was an afterthought, the man whose arrogance, whose ruthless loyalty to his mafia bloodline had shattered her world 3 years ago. She had buried his number. She had erased him from her life. She had sworn never to hear that voice again. Yet here he was, breathing on the other end of the phone, sounding like a storm she never wanted to face again. For a split second, she forgot how to breathe. Every memory, every argument, every goodbye, every promise he broke came rushing back with punishing clarity. She opened her mouth to speak, but Max released a soft, painful cry, a sound laced with weakness and fear. The tiny cry traveled through the speaker, slicing through the cold distance of the call like a truth Alex was never supposed to hear. Jenni felt her heart drop into her stomach as the realization of her mistake washed over her. On the other end, Alex's entire world halted. The cold authority in his voice cracked, replaced with something raw, primal, and shaken. "Jenni, whose child is that?" The question came out low, trembling with something he never allowed anyone to hear: fear. It was the kind of fear that reached into old wounds and forced them open. His breath was unsteady, as though the sound of that fragile cry had struck him harder than any knife, any bullet, any betrayal. He knew something was wrong. He felt something in that cry, something familiar, something that didn't make sense. Jenni's panic surged through her veins like fire. She pressed Max against her chest, gripping him so tightly her knuckles whitened. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat closed as the air around her tightened. She didn't have the luxury of letting her past seep into this fragile present she had fought so hard to protect. She slammed her thumb onto the screen, ending the call so abruptly the silence afterward felt deafening. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and for a moment she couldn't tell whether it was fear or regret tearing through her. Max whimpered again, and she cradled him closer, whispering soft reassurances she no longer had the strength to believe in. Her mind spun with the terror of what she had just done. She had made a mistake, a single slip of exhaustion, and suddenly she had awakened the one man she prayed would never find her again. Jenni paced the room, breath uneven, the walls seeming to close in as the weight of the past pressed against her chest. She knew what Alex was capable of. She knew what his world was like. The moment he sensed something was hidden from him, he would stop at nothing to uncover it. Miles away, Alex stood frozen in the center of his opulent office, unable to move, unable to think of anything but the fragile cry that had echoed through his phone. The sound repeated in his mind, looping over and over until it became a heartbeat, small, pained, familiar. He had heard gunshots, screams, begging, betrayal, but nothing had ever hit him the way that tiny cry just had. His throat tightened, his jaw clenching as he replayed every second of the call. Jenni. After 3 years, her voice, her silence, had hit him with the force of a world he thought he'd buried. And that cry felt like something ripped from his own soul. His breathing grew shallow as realization clawed at him, refusing to let go. The sound of that baby's cry didn't just shake him. It pierced him with a terrifying suspicion he wasn't ready to face. His heart pounded so violently it felt like a fist beating against the inside of his chest, demanding answers. His fists curled at his sides, tension rippling through him like a storm ready to break. He closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to acknowledge the fear spreading through him like poison. He didn't know what scared him more, the possibility that Jenni had a child, or the possibility of whose child it might be. A low, dangerous growl escaped him before he even realized he had spoken. The air in the room thickened with the shift in his energy, the kind of shift his men recognized all too well, the shift that meant someone was about to pay for withholding the truth from him. He grabbed his coat, his steps sharp, heavy, determined, fueled by a fire he hadn't felt in years. The calm facade of the ruthless Mafia air cracked, revealing something far more volatile underneath. He stormed out of his office, ignoring the startled looks of the men standing guard, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Find her," he ordered, each word dripping with a deadly mix of desperation and command. His eyes burned with an intensity that made even his most fearless men flinch. "Find her, now!" And as his men scattered to obey, the echo of that baby's cry lingered around him like a ghost refusing to be forgotten. With his heart pounding like war drums, Alex clenched his jaw and whispered to himself, a promise, a threat, and a confession all at once. "I know that cry, and I'm going to find out why." Jenni stood frozen in her dimly lit apartment, her back pressed against the wall as she tried to calm the storm spiraling inside her chest. Max's small body trembling against her shoulder, his breaths weak and uneven, each tiny gasp reminding her how fragile her world truly was, and she rocked him gently, brushing her lips across his forehead, but nothing could still the unease crawling up her spine. She had barely hung up the phone, barely had time to understand what she had done, when the silence around her shifted into a suffocating tension that made every instinct scream in warning. The past she had buried, the name she had forbidden herself to speak, the man she had run from. He was no longer a ghost in her memory. He was awake now, awake and moving toward her heart pounding so hard it felt like it could bruise her ribs from the inside. And she whispered to Max, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here." But even she didn't believe her own words. Then, without mercy, without pause, without giving her a chance to breathe, a violent knock slammed against her apartment door, exploding through the room like a gunshot. Sharp enough to send Jenni stumbling backward with a gasp, the door rattling under the force, the frame trembling as if the person on the other side wasn't asking to enter. They were demanding it. Max whimpered, startled by the sudden noise, his little fingers digging desperately into her shirt. Jenni felt the blood drain from her face. That knock. She knew it. The rage in it, the authority, the urgency. It was the knock of a man who wouldn't walk away until he got answers. The knock of someone who had spent a lifetime forcing doors open, both literal and emotional. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt too tight. Another knock came, harder, louder, shaking the walls as though he intended to break his way through if she didn't open it. Jenni's breathing turned uneven. She couldn't escape the truth. He had found her. Faster than she believed possible, faster than she was prepared for. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, torn between locking every deadbolt she owned. And knowing it wouldn't matter, Alex Stuart didn't stop for locked doors. He never had. She opened the door only a fraction at first, terrified of what she'd see. But the moment the gap widened enough to reveal him, her entire world crashed into a silence so heavy it felt like gravity doubled. Alex stood beneath the hallway's flickering lights, like a storm given human form. Rain soaked through his dark coat, water dripping from his hair and sliding down the sharp lines of his jaw, his broad chest rising and falling in jagged breaths as if he had sprinted non-stop from wherever he had been to this door, driven by something he didn't know how to control, his eyes. Those cold gray eyes she once knew too well, blazed with a fury she couldn't name. Pain, betrayal, fear, desperation. All of it warred inside him, storming across his expression with devastating intensity. And then slowly his gaze dropped to the tiny bundle in her arms. Something inside him broke, cleanly, visibly, violently. "Jenni?" He breathed, his voice rough from running or shouting or simply feeling too much. He took one step closer, and she instinctively moved back, tightening her hold around Max, that tiny protective gesture making Alex's jaw clamp so tightly she could see the muscles jump beneath his skin. "Tell me who he is," he said, the words cracking beneath the weight of every emotion he had never learned to show. Jenni's lips trembled, her throat constricting with the unfairness of this moment. Because she had wanted him once to care like this, to look at her with this urgency, this fear of losing something that mattered. But back then, he was too blind with pride, too entangled in the chains of his Mafia family to see anything beyond loyalty and legacy. She stared at him with tears gathering behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You left me, Alex," she said, her voice low but steady, even as her chest ached with memories she didn't want to relive. A muscle in his cheek twitched, his expression tightening with painful restraint. He stepped forward, allowing the light to catch the raw vulnerability shining through the cracks of the man he once pretended to be. "I left because I was a fool," he said, the confession heavy and honest, the kind of truth that seemed to scrape out of him like glass. "Because I was drowning in a world I didn't know how to escape. But—" His voice lowered, roughened, thickened with emotion he fought to control. "But I never would have walked away from a child. Not from mine." The words hit her like a blow, because they were true and because they were too late. She tried to speak, but before she could gather the strength, Max shifted in her arms, his face brushing against her collarbone. As he tried to lift his head, Alex stilled completely, his entire body turning toward that small, fragile movement. Jenni felt him staring, felt the intensity of his gaze like a physical force. As Max slowly raised his face, his eyes opened, those sharp, unmistakable gray eyes, Alex's eyes staring up at the man who had never known he existed. The world didn't just pause, it shattered. Alex staggered back a step as if the floor beneath him had tilted without warning. He pressed a hand flat against the door frame, his fingers trembling, his breath collapsing into a broken whisper. His gaze locked on Max, locked on the reflection of himself staring back at him with innocent confusion. Jenni watched his face crumble. The powerful Mafia heir, the man whose name made grown criminals tremble, the man she once loved and feared in equal measure. He broke, right there in her doorway. Jenni. His voice didn't even sound like him anymore. It sounded like a man who just realized he had lost something he didn't even know to look for. Jenni. He swallowed hard, unable to look away from the child. That's my son, isn't he? The air grew impossibly still. Jenni hugged Max closer. Alex took a shaky step toward them, eyes glistening with a storm of emotions no one had ever seen him wear. The truth was right there between them, beating like a living thing. Before she could answer, before she could speak a single word, the hallway lights above them gave a sharp, buzzing flicker, plunging them into a momentary shadow. The hum grew louder, the tension sharpening into something colder, more dangerous. And then the light stabilized, revealing a silhouette standing at the far end of the corridor, silent still, watching them. Alex's entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second, the vulnerability vanishing, replaced by lethal instinct. His shoulders squared, his voice dropped, and his eyes narrowed with deadly precision. "Jenni," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the figure. "Get inside, now." And as he spoke those words, the air thickened with the promise of danger lurking closer than they realized. And for the first time, Jenni understood that the storm she had feared was only just beginning. The flicker of the hallway lights and the shadowy figure at the end of the corridor had barely registered in Jenni's mind when a sudden shift in the air made her body tense, every muscle coiling with instinctive fear. And before she could even think, Alex's hands were on her, pulling her and Max behind him with a speed and precision that spoke of years of training, of survival, of instincts honed in a world she had never been part of, his body a solid shield between her and the unknown threat lurking outside. And she clutched Max closer, feeling the rapid rise and fall of his tiny chest against her own, heart hammering in rhythm with the pounding of her own. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized she was witnessing the other side of Alex, the dangerous, unrelenting force that once terrified her, the same man who had walked away from her without a backward glance, now standing between them and an invisible enemy with a ferocity that made her entire being tremble. She had barely processed the relief of his presence when a movement outside the door caught her attention. A shadow slipping silently against the wall, a figure she could barely make out in the flickering light. And before she could react, Alex growled low in his throat, a sound she had once feared and now felt strangely safe behind, his eyes narrowing, scanning the corridor with deadly precision. He had recognized the intruder instantly, one of his old rivals, a man who had been waiting, watching, planning, ever since Alex had tried to distance himself from the world of the family business, a man who had a score to settle and no intention of leaving anyone alive to stop him. Alex's hands gripped her arms, holding her back as he shifted slightly, his body angled protectively, and she could feel the tension radiating from him. The kind of tension that had once been reserved for enemies, now directed at anyone who dared threaten his son or the woman he had never stopped loving. The shadow outside hesitated, sensing the power radiating from him, the aura of someone who had survived worse than this, someone who could kill without hesitation if provoked. But the seconds stretched endlessly, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in the silent hallway, until Alex took a deliberate step forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming, and the shadow flinched, realizing it had underestimated him. With a swift motion, he shoved the man back, a warning that carried both authority and lethal intent, forcing the intruder to retreat, at least for the moment, leaving Jenni's mind spinning with fear, awe, and confusion all at once. She stared at Alex, her eyes wide. Max clinging to her as she whispered, almost in disbelief, "This is why I kept Max hidden," her voice trembling, carrying both exhaustion and unspoken anger. the words barely more than a breath, but heavy with the weight of years spent in isolation, protecting the one part of her world that mattered from the dangerous currents of Alex's life she had barely survived. Alex's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, his hardened exterior cracking just enough for her to see the man she had once loved, the man who had been cruelly arrogant and impossibly blind, now weighed down by guilt and regret that seemed to seep from every line of his face. He looked at her with a mixture of shame and longing, the kind of look that made her chest ache in ways she hadn't felt in years. "I was arrogant, Jenni," he admitted, his voice low and gravelly, each word deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of remorse he had held in silence for far too long. "I thought the Mafia world was all I had. I didn't know you were carrying the part of me I never deserved," he continued, the confession cutting through the distance of their fractured past, leaving no room for denial, no room for pretending, and Jenni's eyes welled with tears, blurring the line between fear and longing, anger and relief. "You didn't even look back," she said, her voice breaking slightly, laden with years of hurt and abandonment, a pain that she had buried deep beneath her role as a mother, beneath the constant vigilance required to keep Max safe from a world that had no mercy for the innocent. Alex swallowed hard, his throat working as he fought to control the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. And finally he whispered, almost as if speaking to himself, "And I've regretted it every day." The words a bitter confession, heavy with truth and sorrow, and in that moment Jenni could see the raw humanity in him, the man beyond the arrogance, beyond the Mafia ties, beyond the mistakes that had cost them everything. But the relief she felt was fleeting, short-lived, because even as she tried to absorb his presence, even as she felt the warmth of recognition and desperation emanating from him, a flicker of motion outside the window drew her attention, a shadow slipping across the glass like a predator moving through the night, and the sudden awareness that they were not yet safe made her pulse spike once more. Her heart raced as she realized that no matter how much she wanted to believe in this moment of reunion, the danger had not ended. It had only evolved, lurking just beyond the fragile barrier of her apartment, waiting for the right instant to strike. Alex followed her gaze, his face darkening instantly, his instincts sharpening, the calm vulnerability from moments ago replaced by lethal alertness, and he murmured, his voice barely audible but carrying undeniable weight. "They followed me. You and Max aren't safe here." The words hitting her like ice, freezing her in place even as he pulled her closer, his hands firm on her shoulders, his body bracing for a fight she didn't yet understand. The shadows outside shifted again, subtle but deliberate, a presence she could feel rather than see, a reminder that Alex's past was not done with him, and by extension, it was not done with them either. Her fingers clutched Max tighter, her nails digging into his soft skin as adrenaline surged through her veins, and she realized that the sanctuary she had built for herself and her son was about to be shattered by forces far beyond her control. Alex's eyes flicked to every corner of the room, every shadow, every potential escape route, and for a moment the past and present collided, the man she had once loved and feared now standing as the only line between them and the danger creeping closer with every heartbeat. The tension in the air was suffocating, the threat unrelenting, and Jenni understood with a cold clarity that the moment she had feared for years, this confrontation with the storm she could not outrun, had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. Alex's voice dropped into a whisper, sharp and urgent, his hand tightening on her arm. "Stay close. Whatever happens, don't let go of him." And the shadow outside shifted once more, just beyond the reach of light, signaling that the storm they thought had passed had only just begun, and that the fight for their survival and for Max's life was about to descend upon them with merciless force. The moment the shadow shifted outside the window became the signal for chaos to erupt. A sudden violent crash of glass, shattering the fragile calm Jenni had barely held on to, and the sound was deafening, slicing through her heart as though the world itself had split in two. And before she could even process it, gunshots tore through the apartment like thunderclaps in the night, sharp and merciless, echoing against the walls, ricocheting in every corner, forcing Jenni to throw her arms over Max instinctively as she screamed, a sound of pure terror and disbelief, the kind that no mother ever wants to make. And in that instant, Alex's body slammed around them like a shield forged from steel in desperation, his arms locking around her and Max, his broad chest absorbing the fury of bullets that tore into the walls, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Every shot a reminder that the world Alex had tried to leave behind had followed him here, had found them no matter how hidden they thought they were, and Jenni's heart pounded violently, her breath caught in her throat as she clung to Max, her fingers digging into his soft skin, his small hands clutching at her hair and clothing, their connection a fragile anchor in the storm of chaos that had just descended on them. She could feel Alex's muscles tense, his body coiled like a predator, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every angle of attack, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he fought back with brutal precision, moving with the lethal grace of a man who had survived death too many times to be afraid of it, dragging them toward the fire escape, the sound of shattering glass, and ricocheting bullets chasing them with relentless fury, the air outside icy and sharp, slapping against their faces as they emerged into the night, their breaths visible in the cold, the adrenaline fueling their legs as they ran through alleyways slick with rain, every step a frantic escape from the violence that had found them despite every precaution. Jenni's mind was a blur of fear and awe, watching Alex move like a force of nature, protective, merciless, unyielding, and yet all for them, for her and Max, for the life they had fought to carve out in secrecy. And when the sounds of pursuit grew closer, their shadows chasing them through the darkness, Alex pulled them into a narrow passage, then into an abandoned warehouse, the doors creaking as he shoved them inside, his breathing heavy, his movements precise despite the injury he didn't yet acknowledge. The cold metal floor scraped against his clothes as he finally collapsed, a dark red stain spreading across his shoulder, and Jenni's hands flew to the wound instinctively, pressing trembling, desperate fingers over the bleeding, her tears falling freely onto his skin as she shook, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you still risking yourself for us?" Her words carried both fear and disbelief, an echo of the love she had never stopped holding, and in response, Alex lifted his face toward her, his own hands shaking slightly as he cupped her cheek, his gray eyes blazing with a ferocity tempered by vulnerability, his lips brushing against hers for a brief, stolen moment before he spoke, voice low and raw. "Because losing you, losing him, is the one regret I can't live with." And the words hung between them, heavy with truth and unspoken promises, their faces so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath, the soft rise and fall of his chest against her own, the fragile electric connection of two people who had been torn apart and thrown back together in a world that refused to forgive them. They leaned closer still, their eyes locked, every heartbeat echoing the intensity of the moment, the unspoken understanding that nothing outside this fragile cocoon mattered except the life in their arms, until a sudden piercing gasp shattered the fragile intimacy, a sound so small yet so terrifying that it stole the air from Jenni's lungs. Max clutching at his little chest, his tiny body convulsing in sudden panic, and she screamed, a raw, primal sound, throwing herself over him as tears streamed freely, her mind racing, her heart hammering. Alex's body immediately shifting again, hands cradling Max with a precision born from both fear and love, eyes scanning for any sign that this was something more than what it seemed. And the warehouse, silent moments before, now seemed to close in around them, shadows stretching and twisting like predators in the dim light. Every creak of metal and every flutter of darkness amplified into a signal of danger as Alex whispered urgently, voice hoarse yet commanding, "Stay with him. Don't move. Don't let go." And Jenni could barely process the words before Max's chest tightened further, his little hands pressing against his ribs, and she felt her soul twist with helplessness, Alex's eyes widening in horror, a guttural, almost animalistic roar of frustration and fear escaping him as he shook her gently, desperate to keep them both alive. And the shadows in the corners of the warehouse seemed to lean closer, the remnants of their pursuers' presence still lingering, as if the violence had followed them even into this temporary sanctuary. Every flicker of light revealing a new unseen threat, every sound magnified into a signal of impending disaster. The storm outside nothing compared to the one unfolding within the fragile walls around them, and Jenni's voice trembled as she cried, "Alex, he can't breathe." The words slicing through the night like a knife, leaving them suspended in a heartbeat of pure terror, knowing in that instant that the fight for their survival was far from over, and that this night, this moment, would change everything for them. Forever. 5. The moment Jenni screamed, her heart hammering as Max clutched at his chest, Alex's world narrowed into a razor-sharp focus. There was no thought for himself, no consideration of his bleeding shoulder, no memory of his own pain. Only the fragile life of the child in her arms, the boy who bore his eyes, his blood, the one he had never known, yet suddenly could not imagine living without. With a force that made the cold metal floor shake under them, Alex scooped Max from Jenni's grasp, cradling the tiny body with the reverence of a man who understood, for the first time in his life, the weight of unconditional responsibility, while simultaneously pressing himself against Jenni, guiding them through the shadows of the warehouse with precise, urgent movements that left no room for hesitation. The icy night outside assaulted them as they burst into the open, Alex shielding Max with one arm and pulling Jenni close with the other, rain slapping against their faces, seeping through clothes, chilling them to the bone, yet every sense was heightened, every nerve screaming awareness as he propelled them through the narrow alleyways, avoiding puddles, debris, and the silent looming threats that could be lurking behind every corner. The danger that had pursued them from the apartment still pressing in, shadows moving in rhythm with their frantic flight. Jenni clutched Max's tiny body, his fragile whimpers cutting into her like a blade, while her mind raced, flitting between fear and disbelief, between hatred and the faint, lingering spark of hope that Alex's presence stirred within her. The man who had left them, abandoned them, and yet now was the only barrier standing between life and death for the boy she had fought so hard to protect. Her tears fell freely, mingling with the rain, and her voice quivered as she whispered frantic apologies to Max, to Alex, to the universe for the mistakes that had led them here, for the years spent alone, shielding her son from a world he never deserved to know. Her words lost in the chaotic soundscape of pounding feet, heavy breaths, and the distant echo of danger that seemed to stretch behind them, following their every step. When the hospital came into view, the bright fluorescent lights cutting through the night, Jenni felt a sliver of relief, yet the terror had not eased, because she knew these doors could not erase the night they had just survived, could not undo the memories etched into every soaked, shivering fiber of her being, could not shield Max from the fragility of his own heart. The sliding doors opened with a hiss, and nurses immediately appeared, rushing toward them, their efficiency clashing with Jenni's hysteria, their urgency a mirror to the storm she carried inside her chest. Alex's hands remained locked on hers, grounding her, holding her trembling fingers in a grip that was both fierce and tender, and she could feel the weight of his presence as more than a protective force. He was the man who had walked away, and now he was the man who could not leave again, his own guilt evident in every tense line of his face, every shallow breath that rattled from his chest. "Jenni," he said, voice breaking as he pressed a hand to her back, steadying her as the nurses whisked Max away into the sterile hallways. "Tell me what's wrong with him." Her voice cracked under the strain of exhaustion, fear, and years of grief that had never fully healed. "Max has a heart condition. Since birth," she whispered, her words trembling like leaves in a storm. "I begged for help, but you were gone, Alex. Gone into that violent world your family worships." The confession hung in the air, heavy and accusing, cutting through the sterile smells of disinfectant and antiseptic, and Alex's face crumbled. The arrogance he had once wielded like armor now shattered, replaced by raw, unfiltered guilt. "If I had known, Jenni, I swear I would have given him everything I have," he murmured, voice thick, shaking, each word a promise and a regret wrapped together, his face pale, jaw clenched, eyes glistening in the harsh fluorescent light. Jenni's tears fell freely now, the strain of years manifesting in a flood of emotion she could no longer contain, and her pain struck him harder than any bullet, harder than any enemy he had faced, harder than any betrayal he had survived, piercing through the layers of arrogance and defiance he had worn like a second skin for so long. "I hid him," she whispered, voice trembling, "because I didn't want the Mafia to touch him." The admission cutting deep into the remnants of his pride, leaving him exposed, raw, and human. A father who had been absent for years, suddenly confronted with the weight of responsibility, the impossible task of making right what had been wronged before he even knew it existed. Before either of them could process further, a doctor approached, face tight, eyes scanning the room with the practiced urgency of someone accustomed to life and death situations, yet unprepared for the intensity of the emotion that radiated from the pair standing before him. "We need the father's consent for a critical surgery," he said, voice brisk, professional yet laced with the gravity of the situation. And Jenni froze, her stomach twisting, every nerve on edge. The weight of the words pressing down like a stone in her chest, the reminder that her son's life hung in the balance, that she alone could not make this decision, that the man who had abandoned them now held the power to save him. Or fail. Alex didn't hesitate. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, but the raw intensity of a father's love shone through as he stepped forward, voice calm but resolute. "I'm his father. I'll sign it." The doctor hesitated, glancing between them, then back at Alex, as though weighing the weight of his words, and finally spoke, "Then you should know. This surgery carries a high risk." The words falling like icy water over them both, the tension stretching taut, a fragile thread threatening to snap with every heartbeat. Jenni's knees buckled, the gravity of their situation overwhelming her, tears streaming as she collapsed into Alex's arms, the solidity of his chest and the warmth of his embrace grounding her even as the terror consumed her, and she whispered through choked sobs, "Please, don't let me lose him." The words a fragile prayer, a desperate plea, a surrender to the man she had once cursed for leaving, the man who now held their only chance of survival in his hands. And in that moment, the hospital lights seemed too bright, too sterile, the world outside too indifferent, and all that existed was the fragile, beating life of their son and the promise of a man determined to face every danger, every risk, every enemy, to save him. The seconds stretched into an eternity as Jenni sank into Alex's arms, her body trembling from exhaustion, fear, and the unrelenting adrenaline of the night. While the hospital corridor hummed with a sterile, indifferent rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos still pulsing in her veins. Her tears soaked his shirt, mingling with the faint rain that clung to him from earlier, and every sob felt like a dagger cutting through the armor he had built around himself for years. She pressed her face into his chest, inhaling the faint scent of leather, rain, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Memories of past nights and past mistakes swirling around her mind, the years of abandonment, the silent pain, the lonely nights spent wondering why he had walked away. And yet now, for the first time, the man who had haunted her dreams, the one who had left a void in her life, was here, solid and present, his hands trembling as they held her with a desperation that matched her own. Each heartbeat seemed to echo against the walls, the sound of life and fear intertwining, a fragile thread linking them to Max, the boy who lay on the operating table, his tiny life suspended by the skill of strangers and the determination of the father he had only just met. Finally, Jenni broke the silence, her voice cracking under the weight of years spent holding back a torrent of anger and grief. "I hated you, Alex," she whispered, her words trembling like fragile glass, threatening to shatter with the force of her emotion. "I hated the man who walked away without caring." She pulled back slightly to look at him, her eyes searching for any semblance of the man she had loved, the man who had abandoned her and left her to fight alone, and she saw the raw, unpolished truth in his expression. The kind of truth that stripped away arrogance, pride, and the false strength he had once worn like armor. Alex shut his eyes as if closing them could shield him from the depth of his own remorse. And when he spoke, his voice was rough, quivering, unsteady, laced with the vulnerability he had never shown her before. "I cared too much," he confessed, each word weighted with years of silent suffering. "That's why I drowned myself in the Mafia. It was all I knew. And I didn't know how to be a good man for you." His admission landed with the force of a sledgehammer, the kind of honesty that left Jenni stunned, her throat constricted, and her heart aching with the strange mixture of grief and relief, because for the first time, the man she had loved and hated was showing the fractured human pieces beneath the hardened exterior, the layers of pain and fear that had dictated his every action, and now, finally, were laid bare. She studied him, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words could capture the storm inside her, the tumult of anger, love, betrayal, and longing swirling into one incoherent mix, until she finally asked, voice trembling, "Then why fight now?" Her question was a thread reaching out, testing whether the man before her could truly grasp the weight of their son's life, whether his remorse was genuine, whether the love she had buried, locked away for survival, was recognized at last. Alex reached for her, lifting her chin with a gentle, deliberate hand, forcing her to meet the storm of his gray eyes, intense and unwavering, filled with determination, fear, and a love so raw it made her pulse falter. "Because you're the only woman who ever loved me without fear," he whispered, his lips brushing her temple, as if the simple contact could anchor them both in the chaos surrounding them. "And Max, he's the only light in my darkness. I'll give up everything, my family, my power, my name, if it means he lives." His words were solemn, heavy with promise and threat alike, and Jenni felt the ground shift beneath her feet, reality bending around the magnitude of his declaration, realizing that the man who had once abandoned her was now willing to dismantle his entire world for the child she had fought so hard to protect. She swallowed, words failing her, as the fluorescent lights above hummed, the sterile air pressing against their faces, carrying the faint metallic smell of antiseptic and fear. and for a brief heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, suspended in the fragile bubble of their connection, two hearts clinging desperately to hope amidst the storm raging both outside and within. But the fragile moment shattered instantly, cutting through the tenuous calm like a blade, when the alarm from the surgery room blared, piercing, urgent, demanding attention, and Alex's hand shot to Jenni's arm, gripping her with a ferocity born of fear and paternal instinct. The piercing red light of the surgical monitors flashed through the hallway windows, casting an ominous glow on their faces, highlighting every line, every wrinkle, every shadow of exhaustion, every drop of grief and adrenaline that traced the contours of their skin. The sterile hum of machines, the frantic footsteps of nurses, the sharp bark of instructions, all collided into a cacophony of panic and urgency, and Jenni's body froze, her mind unable to process the speed with which life and death had shifted around them once again. She pressed herself closer to Alex, feeling the tremor in his hands as he held her, his face tight, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the corridor as if the danger they had just escaped had somehow followed them into the pristine halls of the hospital. Every second stretched unbearably long, a tense suspension between hope and despair, the minutes slowing as though the universe itself was holding its breath, and the hollow sound of the alarm sent waves of terror through her chest, threatening to crush her entirely. Alex's lips moved close to her ear, voice low, tight, trembling with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Code red! The child is crashing!" The word struck her with the force of lightning, her stomach twisting violently as adrenaline and fear collided, and she felt the air leave her lungs in a suffocating gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth as if to scream, but no sound emerged. The terror lodged too deep. And Alex's hands tightened on her shoulders, grounding her, a lifeline in the storm of their lives. The same hands that had shielded them from bullets and predators, now trembling with the magnitude of their son's fragility. The hospital corridor, bright and sterile moments before, seemed suddenly oppressive. The walls closing in, the fluorescent lights strobing like warning signals, the distant echo of the surgical team's hurried steps, a constant reminder of the fragile thread upon which Max's life hung. Every instinct screamed, every thought screamed, yet nothing could prepare Jenni for the raw, palpable panic radiating from Alex, the man she had once hated, now reduced to a father clinging to the one thing he could not live without. And she realized in that instant that their battle was far from over, that the past, the danger, the love, the guilt, and the threat of death were all colliding in a single heartbeat, and nothing, no force, no power, no arrogance, could stop what was unfolding. The seconds crawled, stretched into hours, as Jenni and Alex clung to each other in the silent tension of the hospital corridor, each heartbeat amplified, each breath shallow and uneven, every passing moment weighted with the fragility of life. The sterile hum of machines, the distant beeping of monitors, the faint scent of antiseptic, it all merged into a background that felt both unreal and suffocating, as if the world outside these walls had ceased to exist. Jenni's hands trembled in Alex's grasp, her face pressed against the hard plane of his chest, her tears soaking through his coat, yet she could feel the warmth, the solidity, the undeniable presence of the man who had been absent for years and now was everything. They sat in a tense limbo, the weight of the past pressing down like an invisible vice, every memory of abandonment, every moment of loneliness, every sleepless night with Max flooding back in brutal clarity, yet tempered by the hope that the man she had hated, the man who had returned in a storm of rain, bullets, and confession, was now wholly, irrevocably theirs. Alex's hand cradled her head, fingers tangling in her hair, his thumb brushing the tears from her cheeks with a gentleness that felt foreign and sacred all at once. He was still the man she had loved once, still the storm she had feared, Yet in that quiet, frozen moment, he was more than that. He was the father he had never been. The man willing to give everything he had ever been for the boy lying unconscious somewhere beyond the door, fighting for his life. Then finally the door at the end of the hallway swung open, and the doctor emerged, exhaustion etched deep into every line of his face, sweat glistening on his temple, yet a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. His eyes, usually cold and measured, softened, and for a brief instant time itself seemed to halt. "He made it," the doctor announced, voice careful, deliberate, carrying the gravity of what had just occurred. "Max is alive." Those words landed like a tidal wave, crashing through every fiber of Jenni's being, and she let out a strangled cry, a sound of release and terror and pure, unfiltered relief all at once, without hesitation, without thought. She collapsed into Alex's chest, her body shuddering violently, tears streaming down her cheeks and soaking the front of his coat. Alex, unprepared for the full force of her emotion, wrapped his arms around her, holding her closer than he had ever held anything in his life, as if in that embrace he could protect her from every danger, past, present, and future. His own eyes glistened with tears, silent, unshed, a reflection of the pain, regret, and fear that had haunted him for years. And in that embrace, the two of them communicated everything that words could not: sorrow, relief, love, fear, and a tentative, fragile hope that perhaps the world could still be theirs, whole and untangled from the chaos that had defined them for so long. After what felt like an eternity, Alex finally gently guided Jenni forward, and they moved toward Max's room, their steps slow, hesitant, each movement weighted with the cautious hope that the child inside was as resilient as he had fought to be, as miraculous as the small chance they had clung to. The moment they opened the door, they saw him lying there, tiny, fragile, yet unmistakably alive, the faint rise and fall of his chest a balm to every fear that had gripped their hearts. Max's small hand lifted weakly, fingers stretching toward them, and Jenni felt a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to tear her in two. Alex moved closer, lowering himself until he could cradle the little hand in his own, brushing his lips gently against the skin, letting the tears fall silently as he felt the weight of responsibility, love, and redemption all collide in that singular act. Jenni watched, awestruck and trembling, as the man she had once known as a Mafia prince, an arrogant heir to a violent legacy, transformed before her eyes. Not a man of power or fear, but a father desperate to protect his family, desperate to make amends, desperate to choose love over legacy, life over violence, humanity over cruelty. She saw the depth of his transformation, the slow, steady shift of a heart that had once been hardened by pride and blood now softened by love and fear, and her chest tightened with hope and disbelief. The soft beeping of the monitors, the quiet hum of the hospital, the faint whispers of nurses outside the door, all faded into the background as Alex spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of irrevocable choice. "I'm leaving the Mafia, Jenni," he said, eyes locked on hers, unflinching. "I've already cut ties. My family roots end with me. I choose you, and I choose him." Jenni's heart stammered, a wild, unpredictable flutter of hope, disbelief, and fear. The man who had once left her, abandoned her, and driven her to protect their son alone, was now vowing to sever every tie to the world that had corrupted him, the world that had stolen so much from them. Her lips trembled as she whispered, voice barely audible, "Alex, can you really walk away from that world?" His eyes softened, the ice replaced by warmth, the distance replaced by intimacy and resolve. "I already have," he replied, his tone steady, resolute, yet infused with a tenderness that made her pulse hammer in her chest. My future is right here. And in that moment, the fragility of the past, the weight of betrayal, the violence and danger that had once defined them, all of it dissolved into a singular truth. Their life, their family, and the boy lying between them, alive and breathing, was all that mattered. Jenni knelt beside Max's bed, brushing a lock of hair from his damp forehead, and felt a profound surge of gratitude and love that left her trembling. Alex stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, grounding her as tears continued to fall. Not only for the terror they had survived, but for the man who had finally chosen love over power, life over fear, family over legacy. They shared a long, silent moment, their eyes meeting, communicating a depth of emotion that words could never encompass. Forgiveness, redemption, hope, and the promise of a new beginning. Max's tiny hand reached again toward Alex, and this time he grasped it firmly, a small but unmistakable connection that cemented the bond they had been denied for years, a bond that no danger, no past, no violence could sever. Alex leaned closer, brushing his lips against Max's hand once more, inhaling the faint, miraculous scent of their son's skin, and whispered softly, "We're together now. Nothing can take this from us." Jenni nodded, her tears blurring the edges of the world, yet she felt an unwavering certainty. A fragile but resilient hope that the family they had longed for, suffered for, and fought to protect could finally exist outside the shadows of fear and blood. Then, just as Max's eyes fluttered open, revealing a small, tentative smile, the room filled with the soft hum of life renewed, of love reclaimed. A flicker of motion drew Alex's attention to the window. There, outside, framed by the cold steel and glass of the hospital exterior, a familiar, dangerous figure lingered, watching with intent that chilled him to the bone. Yet for the first time, he did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not retreat, because he had chosen a new path, and nothing would sway him from protecting the family he had finally claimed. Max's tiny smile, weak but unwavering, was a beacon, a declaration that life had not been defeated, that love had not failed, that hope had survived. Alex's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to face whatever threat loomed outside. Yet he turned back to Jenni, brushing a stray tear from her cheek, and whispered softly, "Whatever comes next, we face it together. Always." Jenni nodded, holding both Max and Alex close, their hearts beating in unison, a new legacy born from pain, love, fear, and the courage to choose family over everything else. And outside the window, the world could wait. Their family, at last, was home. Thank you for joining me on Heartwoven Tales today. I hope this story touched your heart, kept you on the edge of your seat, and reminded you that love, hope, and courage can conquer even the darkest times. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another story that will take you on an emotional journey. And I'd love to hear from you. What part of today's tale moved you the most? Until next time, I'm Selena, signing off, but remember, every heart has a story waiting to be woven.